couldn't see, adjusting his glasses. He looked up. Seated on the far side of the room reading a book was John Schmidt, his communications director. "I can't read this goddamn thing," said Allaire. "You're the one who said you wanted one," said Schmidt. "Remember? It's the future and all that." "Yeah, well, I changed my mind. I'm sick of pretending I like these fucking things." Schmidt nodded. "We'll go back to the Daily Notebook, sir." "Good. In the meantime, have you read this editorial by our friends at the New York Times?" "How the hell is the New York Times editorial board aware of what's happening in Geneva?" "It's coming out of the Swiss Foreign Ministry," said Schmidt. "They're taking the credit, which is not necessarily a bad thing. To the extent it adds to the public pressure on Tehran, it's helpful." There was a knock on the door, and in stepped two men, Hector Calabrese, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Tim Lindsay, the U.S. Secretary of State. Calabrese and Lindsay, who'd been out shooting at the camp's private skeet range, were both dressed in shooting attire. Calabrese was an expert shot. He came up through the ranks of the CIA paramilitary and was deft with most weapons known to man. Lindsay, a retired former admiral in the Navy and lifelong hunter, was even better. "Well, if it isn't Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid," said Allaire, a shit-eating grin on his face as he watched the two men stomp their boots on the welcome mat and remove their filson coats. "Either of you managed to hit anything?" "No, Mr. President," Calabrese said politely. "We thought it would be impolite to hit more clays than you." Allaire laughed. "Wise guy," said Allaire as Rico returned to the sitting area near the fireplace. "Do you two have time for a drink before you leave for D.C.? "Sure," said Calabrese. "Same thing as the president, Rico." "Pappy Van Winkle," said Lindsay, looking at Rico. "If there's any left, a couple of rocks. Thanks, Rico." "Yes, sir," said the bespectacled servant, who turned and left for the kitchen. "Seriously," continued Allaire, "who won?" "It's not a contest," said Calabrese, his confident smile leaving little doubt as to who hit more clays that afternoon. He moved to one of the sofas and sat down. "I'm 64 years old, for Christ's sakes," said Lindsay, sitting across from Calabrese next to Schmidt. "I'm surprised I hit anything." "I've heard that one before," said Allaire, taking a sip from his beer and shaking his head at Lindsay. "Right before you took $20 off me." "That was a lucky day, Mr. President," said Lindsay as Rico brought a tray with drinks on it. The four men sat talking about skeet shooting and hunting for a long time, the president regaling the others with a story about the time as governor of California, when he'd gone dove hunting with then Vice President Cheney just a few months after Cheney had strafed someone with an errant shot. The story, as with most of Allaire's elaborate and expertly told stories, left the other three in laughter. Allaire stood and put more wood on the fire, played with the arrangement of the logs for a time, then returned to his chair. "Before we take off, Mr. President," said Lindsay, "we need to discuss the proposal by the Swiss Foreign Minister." "We've already discussed it," said Allaire. "I gave you my answer 2 days ago, Tim. I refuse to sit down with the president of Iran. It's that simple. Ambassador Veeder believes that if we agree to a summit, with you and President Nava meeting one-on-one, that the Iranians will renounce their nuclear ambitions and might even agree to begin talks with the Israelis. I trust Iran about as far as I can throw them," said Allaire. "They're lying. I've seen this movie before, Tim. I don't like the ending." Lindsay nodded at the president. "We have to consider the larger objective," said Lindsay. "The Iranian government is reaching out to us. This meeting would be the first step towards normalizing relations between our countries." "They're playing the Swiss, and they're attempting to play us," said Allaire, nodding across the room at Rico, indicating he wanted another beer. "President Nava has created a distraction which he's using to get us to take our eye off the ball. So while he makes the world and the New York Times believe he's had a change of heart, Iran continues to pour tens of millions of dollars into Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda, and they continue to build a nuclear weapon. We don't have definitive proof the Iranians are constructing a nuclear bomb, sir," said Lindsay. Allaire glanced at Calabrese. "Here we go again," said Allaire, shaking his head. "We know they are, Tim," said Calabrese.